We'll start in a couple minutes. It's actually already after 7:30. My name is Steve, and I'm here to welcome you. So tonight we have a great program, which we'll get to toward the end. But I wish to make some announcements and thanks. I want to thank people who donated these plants for our raffle tonight. There's quite the selection, and we'll go over those in a bit. I also want to thank Karina and Serge, who always bring a great ensemble of goodies and decaf coffee at my request. And, these are kept going by donations by folks like you. I also want to point out in the back, we have a new product for sale. Where's Ricky? She said she'd model for us. So the chapter hired an artist, a local artist, Kim Heisett, to put together this beautiful, this is a watercolor and printed on the shirt. That's the unisex shirt. And it's got our chapter name and logo on the back, so you can advertise for us. And what is the what is the small price of these shirts, Karina?
So this is the ladies fit shirt. The difference is there's no chapter logo on the back. The one Ricky's wearing has the logo on the back. The shirts are 25. The mug is 15, and these very nice totes are 25.
Yeah, those are some really nice totes. They look pretty rugged.
Cotton, as well as the t-shirts, 100% cotton.
Yeah, we decided to upgrade some of the shirts. We didn't want the lower standard stuff. We also have mugs for sale. And what is the price of these mugs? $15. And of course, yeah, you can buy these online, or I guess you could buy them in the back. I don't know. Are we? Okay. So see Karina. Okay. I want to welcome, are there any, well, yeah, Jeff Blakely's here. He's a new Dade member, although Jeff, you used to be a member before, right? Yeah, so Jeff's here. Any other new members to the chapter? And what is your name? Patricia. Well, welcome, Patricia, and welcome to the chapter. I want to thank all of you who renewed recently. And I do have an announcement. We have Brian, our past president here. He's chair of the nominating committee. So if you feel like your leadership material, there are positions on the board that are open, and you can contact Brian. We are looking for an education and outreach chair for sure. There's lots of events, especially this time of year. You can only imagine all the emails we get because Earth Day is next month. So everyone wants us to go to their events, but we need someone to help manage that. So all you need is a good smile and wear deodorant, like I said before. FNPS is going greener. I didn't know that. Digital Palmetto for stronger conservation impact. So they're going there. And then, of course, next month, in a couple weeks, will be the Florida Native Plant Study Conference, which has been absent since the COVID. Is it next week? Okay, next week, late next week. It starts on Thursday, right? April 3rd through 6th, and it's going to be in Gainesville. I'm assuming it's not full. It's not too late to attend. So You might want to check that out if you have a family in Gainesville and a place to stay, although you could stay in a hotel too. The title of the conference is Seeds for Tomorrow. If you have some nice things that you think would represent our chapter fairly well, we are putting together a gift basket to donate for the conference's silent auction. Okay, so we're looking for small things. Don't give us your used National Geographic collection. Right. Let's see. That's done. There's a plant biologist in South Florida meeting on the 12th of April. This meets annually. And this year it's at the Kampong. So if you're a researcher in the field.
Not at the Kampong, it's next door, the FIU's International Center for Tropical Botany, which is right next door to the Kampong.
Okay.
Okay. So you don't want to drive into the driveway of the Kampong. It's a separate driveway with a black gate to the FIU.
Okay. Yeah, it does say FIU International Center for Tropical Botany at the Kampong.
Yes, yeah, but it's not.
Okay.
Next door.
Kampong was David Fairchild's old home. Yeah, you need to register on that. And there's information in the Tillandsia. I also want to announce the next 2 days, there's an activity over by Lucky Hammock. We've been helping the manager there. Her name is Karen Allman from the South Florida Water Management District. And these next 2 days, they're pulling Syngonium. I do know Scott is attending, so you won't be alone if you show up. You just meet at the parking lot at 9 a.m. And if you're a bit late, you just walk down the levee road toward the hammock. She recommends you bring water and a snack. She'll provide gloves and bags.
Perfectly heavy gloves.
She said she'd have gloves, so I'm guessing they'll be legit. Next meeting in April, we have, I'm going to mess up his name, Jim Forkurian of FIU Seagrass Lab. So he'll be giving a talk, I'm assuming, on seagrasses. That's Earth Day? Oh boy. Okay. Are there any other announcements?
Yes.
Okay.
So, on the 19th, we have different place.
Yeah, it's only $35.
No, it's $5.
To join to join FNPS, it costs $35.
$5.
So Crandon Park on Key Biscayne. There's no zoo there anymore. So, all right, thank you, Patty. Are there any other announcements? Okay, I do want to, I'd be remiss in not acknowledging that we had a wonderful Native Plant Day on Saturday. The last several Native Plant Days, it was the president that spearheaded it, although the president always had help. When I came in on president, I said, I'm not going to do that. And Jeannie reluctantly said she'd do it, but she does a lot of work in the background anyway, but she did an amazing job. And I want to thank Jeannie personally. And she didn't do it alone. There were lots of board volunteers, and Patty Ferris helps out, and And but it was a great show, and we had almost 500 participants attend. It was a beautiful day. We had 4 plant vendors. We had the artists. We had music for the first time that I can recall, and I liked the music. What you guys think? Did you like the music? Yeah. And which one was it? The native plant song? Plant native? Okay. So that was Grant Livingston, and he's a local folk singing artist, and of course our local artist Kim, who did our T-shirt, was also there. So if you missed it, you suck. No, I mean if you missed it, you really missed out. So before I begin introduce tonight's speaker, I'll introduce our raffle plants. Who is selling raffle tickets tonight? Rena, you're selling T-shirts. You're going to do both? Sergio's going to sell raffle tickets? He's shaking his head no. I already know that. All right, so I guess Karina will sell raffle tickets. If there are any other board members that want to help out, or past board members, is Jen here? Jen could help out. Sell raffle tickets, Jen? No? Okay. How much are the raffle tickets, Jen? Two for $1, but you're really better off buying 12 for $5, right? So. Some interesting items tonight. Not only do we have plants, but we have some nice things like this copy of Peterson's Field Guide to Birds. This is a really, Peterson is the ultimate field guide. That was the beginning of it all. And then we have this nice, I'm not going to pick it up, but for those of you who are botanically inclined, we have this probably out of print poster of the endemic and endangered plants of Bermuda. And this is printed in 1981. And it's in fairly great condition. And for it to be in a raffle, I mean, that's a pretty bargain, Bermuda's got some interesting things because it's off, I guess the closest to the US is like South Carolina. So, but it has tropical and temperate affinities and a lot of endemism. All right, now we got a wonderful assortment of plants. I recognize Raoul's square pots. So a lot of these were grown by Raoul for the day chapter. And if you weren't aware, we do have an online plant store. So if you don't win any of these, you can buy a lot of these online. And they're not very expensive. They're usually like $4, $5. And it's a great way to start some native plants in your yard. And Raoul tends to focus mostly on wildflowers that are hard to find that aren't grown at native plant nurseries. So one of these that is here is an annual, but it's a native called Cinna obtusifolia is the scientific name. And the common name is sicklepod. And this is kind of a lawn weed. It has real pretty yellow flowers. I talk about this in my lawn weed talk from a million years ago. And this is a host plant for 2 or 3 different sulfur butterflies. Related to it is another species of Cinna, which is this one here, privet Cinna. Now, this is a taller shrub perennial, tends to be more narrow than wide. And this also has beautiful yellow flowers, and it also attracts 3 different sulfur species. The cloudless, I think, is it the sleepy dog and a large orange, I think, are the 3. I get cloudless in my yard. And what's interesting, if the caterpillars feed on the leaves, they tend to be green. And if they feed on the flowers, they tend to be yellow. But the butterflies are always yellow. So here we have near endemic. This is Havana skullcap. It's only found in Dade County and outside of Cuba. IRC defined near endemics are things that are only found in South Florida, the Bahamas, and Cuba. And this is Scutellaria havanensis. I don't think this is even in the Bahamas. This grows in pine rockland or on the edges of hammocks. It's in the mint family. It's got these real pretty purple flowers. It's a low growing herb. When I say herb, that just means it's not woody. It doesn't mean you can eat it. All right. This can grow in full sun best if it will tolerate partial shade. That's a Havana skullcap, a pine rockland species. Here we have a wonderful plant that grows in shade. We've tried growing it in the nursery. It's hard to make look good. And if it doesn't look good, it doesn't sell good. But once you get it in the ground, this one looks great. Once you get it in the ground, all you have to do, like I could take this branch and pull it off, throw it on the ground and dump some mulch on it, and it'll survive and spread. Most people would be terrified of that because they think it'd take over. But this does best in the rainy season, and then it sort of tails off in the dry season. But what's nice about this basket grass, Oplismonus hortellus, is that it will tolerate shade. So a lot of us have yards that are already full of plants. So this is one you can put in your yard that's full of plants and it'll do well. In the winter, what I do with mine is I'll water it on occasion so that it doesn't completely disappear. Here we have a native edible, which is also an herb. This is a Walter's ground cherry, and you see these little lanterns here. This is in the same genus as Domatillo. It's in the genus Physalis, and this has an edible fruit inside these little lanterns. When these lanterns start to turn brown, it has a little yellow cherry-like fruit that's very sweet, and you can eat it. It's in the same family as tomato, and this is native to both pine rockland as well as coastal strand areas in South Florida. This does best in full sun. The flowers are these little yellow hanging flowers, kind of like a tomato, and it'll have short rhizomes underground. But it's a lovely little herbaceous wildflower. Here's another wildflower. It's a small pot, but this is a great plant for your yard. It likes sun. This is called blue curls. It has these real pretty blue flowers that have like eyelash-like anthers. And this is also in the mint family like that Havana skullcap. And blue curls grows in pinelands, but also in coastal strand like that Walter's ground cherry. And here we have state wildflower. This is Coreopsis leavenworthii. Of course, the way Florida did it is all members of the genus Coreopsis are our state wildflower, and there's probably a dozen species. There's some Coreopsis that are outside of Florida. You might remember the old Florida wildflower plate that had the Texas one with the red center. That's Coreopsis tinctoria. They fixed it, and now the native Coreopsis are on the license plate. So this is an annual though. So this plant will eventually die in like a year or less. But you can take the seeds on the heads and scatter them around and they will resprout in the spring, or you can plant them. Here we have a native epiphyte. Epiphytes are plants that grow on other plants, but they're not necessarily parasitic. So this is a peperomia in the piper family, the same family as black pepper. And this will also grow on floating logs, like in the Fakahatchee. But you can see this in trees. I remember seeing it in mahogany trees and mahogany hammock at one time, a million years ago. And but you can also use this as a ground cover. And like the basket grass, this will grow in shade. The one drawback on this is snails like to eat it. So. Here we have a native blazing star, and this is supposedly Chapman's blazing star. Blazing star is a native wildflower. It's a perennial, but what I call perennial underground. So this will bloom in the fall. In the spring, it kind of resprouts after winter, and it'll start to form more and more leaves, and then it'll send up this big bloom spike. And it'll go all the way up here, and the flowers are determinate. And that usually means that it puts out all its buds, and then it starts flowering from the top down, and it won't produce any more flowers. So that's one way you can identify this genus, which is Liatris. And this is Chapman's blazing star. And this is found in scrubby flatwoods and scrub, but in sandy pine rocklands as well, like you would see at Deering. So if you're not a member, become a member, go to the Deering field trip, and maybe you'll see Chapman's blazing star, although the optimal time to see this is in October. Here we have a wildflower called crane's bill. which is the native geranium, Geranium carolinianum. It's a short-lived wildflower, but it will spread. So this is a good lawn weed. Here we have, it looks like wand goldenrod, which is Solidago stricta, although the name may have been updated. So goldenrods are like blazing stars. They start out with these basal rosettes of leaves, and then it'll put out a bloom spike. This can flower throughout the year, though. They tend to flower in the fall, but I've seen Solidago stricta bloom whenever it wants, and especially after fires. All these pine rockland plants are adapted to fire, so fire is good. So when you see on the news that wildfire last week, it's supposed to burn. You know, it's okay. And these wildflowers love it. So we got 3 of them here, so you have a good chance of winning. Here we have another wildflower called yellow top, and this is in the Asteraceae, which is the sunflower family. Sunflower family is always a great family for pollinators. The blazing stars in that family, and so is the goldenrod that I mentioned. So they usually attract bees, but not just honeybees, the native bees that are, and wasps and all those beneficial insects. This is a perennial that usually stays low to the ground. It often will flatten out in your yard. And this will also bloom multiple times. This is one you can deadhead, where when it's done blooming, you cut it and it resprouts, it reblooms. Lots of plants here. Here we have Florida white top sedge, which is Rincospora floridensis. Some of you old timers may remember it as being called dichromina. This is an actual wildflower. Pollinators do visit the flowers despite it being a graminoid, and it has these white bracts on the flowers. It's not blooming right now, but it will if you don't kill it. Here we have a young, I guess Raul has this new crop of lopsided Indian grass. This is one of the most aesthetically pleasing grasses when you see it in nature. It blooms in August and September, and all the flowers are all on one side of the bloom spike. The bloom spike will be about this tall, and you'll walk into these pinelands, these pine rocklands, or in Music Flatwoods where you'll see this, and it'll look like a field of amber waves of grain. You know, I mean, it looks gorgeous. You'll enjoy that for about 2 or 3 weeks, and then it sort of does its thing. But pine rockland's all about the grasses. The largest plant family in terms of diversity in Florida is the grass family, and it's because Florida's dominant ecosystems are pinelands. People don't think of pines in Florida, but there you have it. And you really want to support the graminoids in your yard. Most of us ignore them. And most of us, nurseries would grow more of them, but no one buys them. So I'm glad that Raul's growing some native graminoids. And believe it or not, they're the ones that are always available because nobody buys them. Here we have a dwarf Fakahatchee grass, but boy, is that dwarf. This is very small. This is going to be a grass that's quite lovely. It's a clumping grass. The other Fakahatchee grass, which is also in the genus Tripsicum, is quite large. And the dwarf Fakahatchee stays about knee height, maybe a little bit above that. And this is a nice perennial grass that actually could be used more as a landscape feature. Lopsided Indian grass, not so much. It's more of a restoration thing, or if you want to increase diversity in your pineland. Here we have 2 species of Cynthia trichum, used to be in the genus Aster. This one is Bahama Aster, which is a wetland species. So you probably would want to have this sort of in a water feature. The other one is a Simmons Aster, which is can grow in uplands or short hydroperiod wetlands. And these are great for pollinators. They have these rather large sunflower looking like flowers, and they bloom almost any time of year, although predominantly in the fall. Here we have a nice seaside ageratum. This also grows in the shade. This is a rare state endangered herb that grows in coastal areas, especially in the Florida Keys. Here we have a beach dune sunflower, a very small one. This will grow quite well in your yard. It needs a label, and the leaves are kind of rough. This has beautiful classic sunflower flowers, but they're not quite as big as the edible sunflowers. And then the lightning round, we also have 2 Simpson stoppers. That's a great small shrub for your yard. Fragrant flowers, attractive and attractive bark, and it will attract lots of pollinators. And then we have 3 beautiful ferns that were grown by Fairchild Tropical Garden. This is Southern Shield Fern, which grows in shade. This, what's that? Oh, Mary grew that. Gosh, Mary. So Mary grew that. This is Bahama ladderbrake, which is Pteris bahamensis. This is a state threatened species. This grows in sunny pinelands. We have the tenarum, which is usually grows on, it's a lithophyte, grows on limestone. If you were to dip this leaf in water, it would turn to silver. It looks silvery because air adheres to the hairs on the leaves and it shimmers. So one of the common names for this is Venus fern. We also have a native Passiflora pallens, and this looks like a Prunus caroliniana, which is our native West Indian cherry, and then some tillandsias. And that is that. All right. I wish to welcome tonight's speaker, who will be talking to us about an endemic palm. I won't take too much away, but Daniel Tucker is an FIU doctoral student and Montgomery Botanical Graduate Fellow. I don't know how much you want me to read in this, but let's pick out the best bits. Your research focuses on identification and conservation of critically endangered and locally threatened palm species in Florida, particularly recently discovered Sabal miamiensis. His work integrates advanced technologies like optical sensors and LiDAR to assess plant health and habitat suitability with traditional botanical field techniques. Your passion for Florida's unique ecosystems drives your commitment to safeguarding biodiversity in the face of climate change. You have anchored multiple publications on palm conservation and sustainable horticultural practices and activities contributing to conservation initiatives throughout our region. You are also an active member of the South Florida Palm Society, the Explorers Club, and reflect your dedication to botanical exploration and conservation. Please give a warm welcome to Daniel.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Steve. I really appreciate it. Alrighty, let's get this show on the road. And good? We're good. All right. And hold on. There we go. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel, and today we're going to be talking about the palms of Florida, specifically Sabal or Sabal, depending on who you ask. So kind of the big thing is Sabals of Florida. So what are we going to be talking about? It's mainly going to be Sabal palmetto. This is the state tree of Florida and of South Carolina. It's the big tall one. You see them everywhere. We have Sabal miamiensis. This was named by Dr. Scott Zona of some of you may know him. Sabal miamiensis is a critically endangered rare endemic palm. There's only about 100 or so left in the wild. Named after the city of Miami. You also have Sabal etonia. This is the one that you see up in Lake Wales a lot. It's a very small scrubby palm, grows in basically straight sand all the way down. And then Sabal minor, that's the swamp cabbage. Very small palm as well, fully stemless aside from a couple select populations. And this one grows in very wet environments, extremely cold hardy too. So where were you going to be talking about? Well, we're talking about pine rocklands. There's only about 2% remaining. They're pretty heavily degraded. Some are in various states of restoration. Some of it is pristine, but for the most part, there's just very little of it. And you can see in the map, there's really not even a whole lot even remaining. Figure says 2%. I believe recent estimates actually put it closer to 1% now. We're really trying to preserve as much of this as possible because it's a biodiversity hotspot. The other big thing we're going to be talking about is pine scrub. So this is just a quick comparison visually between pine scrub and pine rockland. Pine scrub is like Wales Ridge. It's very deep white sugar sand. It's that salacious sand, very acidic. That's when you're going to start seeing a bunch of your scrub plants. Pine rocklands, on the other hand, are exact opposite. It's basically surface rock all the way down. Very little water. Both are very fire moderated. Biggest difference is that the pine scrub is going to be more acidic sands that are very deep and well drained, and pine rockland is going to be very alkaline and just, well, it's rock. So Sabal palmetto, one of the oldest species of palms, was one of the first that was actually named in 1788. And they basically said it's tree-like with fronds converging in the middle with expanded margins. That was it. That was the entire description of Sabal palmetto in 1788. Basically, they saw a tall palm and they just named it. And then later on, we called it Corypha palmetto. And eventually in the 1800s, it was moved to Sabal. So it's found throughout Florida, Caribbean, coastal North Carolina, and in the original description of palmetto, Cuba, question mark. The authors thought it might be there. Turns out that's actually a completely different species, but we're not talking about that one today. So in the image, you can actually see that is a typical palmetto in a flooded hardwood hammock. That's on Archibald Biological Station. They look pretty much like that. They do retain their leaf petioles. Some people call them boots. It's the long spiny things that come out. Some lose them. It's the same thing. So they're very, very plastic and adaptable. What do I mean by that? They can grow in a wide range of habitats. Kind of the unifying theme, though, is that they all have costopalmate leaves. They all produce inflorescences that are longer than their leaves, and they all have trunks. This one in the image is growing in a flooded marl soil out at Montgomery. That individual is about 20 years old. So they get to be about 20 meters tall. They have a nice wide range of pollinators that attracts usually solitary bees and ants. They start flowering in the early summer, and they can produce a good amount of food for small birds and other critters that naturally will disperse it throughout the environment. Sabal palmetto is pretty much known for being a weedy species where it'll produce a bunch of little ones either around the base of the tree or out in the distance. They recruit very well. So one of the other really interesting things about palmetto is that it produces a trunk. I say that because most of Florida palmettos or sabals in general are going to be either kind of short or stunted or not have a trunk at all. And that's an adaptation to fire. So generally, from what I've seen, you'll get at least a 2-meter trunk in about 20 years in under ideal conditions. That'll be elongated in the wild, but generally you'll see something in 20 years. It should not really ever be completely to the ground. One of the neat things, though, is that Sabal palmetto is pretty heavily fire adapted for being a tree-like palm. And you can see in this individual, it's actually been burned about 2 meters up after a recent burn. And at the time of seeing it, this was probably 6 months or so after the burn, and it's still doing all right. And to give you an idea of the scale of these burns, this is me in a pine rockland about 2 weeks after a burn, and that is a young Sabal palmetto that's still alive. That fire reached all the way up and singed the canopy of some of those pines. So the other interesting thing is that palmetto is very adaptable, and it can go in a wide variety of habitats, which means you start to see them in places that you don't. This is in a sapwood fringe along an alkaline scrub site in Dade County. And traditionally, this is not habitat for Sabal palmetto. You're not really supposed to see that. And I suspect that that is actually grown in these more hydric sapwood fringes, but it's not natural to the site. And it's really difficult with some palms to really tell what is natural and what isn't, because you can't really age a palm. So you kind of have to fly with what looks to be similar or what you'd expect. So without getting too technical, we did a little bit of histology work on this. And basically, it's what you'd expect. They're very plastic, they're adaptable, they have a lot of vascular tissue, so these leaves are going to be very rigid and stiff. They're going to have a lot of structural support, and they are going to denote a higher longevity of tissue where they're going to want to hold on to those leaves for as long as possible. They also have pretty decently thick leaf margins as well. So Sabal minor, first described in 1776. It was the first palm, first sabal, or what would become sabal, described in Florida as Corypha minor. It was moved in sabal in 1805, and it's one of the earliest described. And the first sentence of the main description is basically, I haven't found this growing anywhere else, therefore this is something new, ergo Corypha minor. And fun fact, that illustration on the left-hand side is what's called the protologue. That is the first description of the species, and it was that watercolor there growing in the Schönbrunn garden. So it's typically known as dwarf palmetto or swamp cabbage, and it's this really short palm. You can eat it, which is why it's called swamp cabbage. Grows in swamps and other very, very wet areas. And you don't really ever see this in that dry pine rockland or otherwise xeric environment. And one of the interesting things about Sable Minor is that it's extremely cold hardy. You can see this all the way up to Oklahoma now. It's one of the most cold hardy. And one of the more interesting facts about it is that it's also one of the oldest and most distinct lineages of palm in the US. We suspect that most of the sable forms are actually distantly related to Sable Minor for the most part. And it's almost always stemless, without a trunk, aside from a couple of populations out in the bayou and swampy areas. We don't really know what's going on with them, but they form trunks in a really rare circumstance. And the histology reflects what we know about it. They have a lot more hydric tissue, so they're better adapted for dealing with more water than less water. And the leaves are not as robust as, say, Palmetto or Atonia, because they don't have to exist in these really harsh conditions. Then we have Sable Atonia. So this is your scrub palmetto. It was described a little bit later in 1896 from Central Florida. And it was noted for having extremely large fruits. One of the older epithets was megacarpa, large seed or large fruit, because it has fairly decently large seeds. And Sable miamiensis and Sable Atonia both have pretty decently large fruits. And some of the original collections for Atonia was what was used to denote miamiensis. So they're pretty large fruits, all things considered, of those two. But we'll get into that a little bit later. And it's typically found along the Lake Wales Ridge and in ancient sand dunes and deep acidic soils. This is a big characteristic that you'll find it in these, basically just in sand all the way to bedrock. They really like these challenging conditions. And we'll see some later, but they can survive burns. They can survive in really just terrible conditions. But they don't do so well in South Florida because we tend to be a bit wet in our soils unless it's been amended. And it's very rare in Dade County. Some people have seen things that are similar. I think that it's fairly rare in Dade County, even from the observation that's seen, but more on that later. So one of the neat things is that their hastulas tend to be about 4 centimeters and symmetrical. With a palm, it has this connective tissue where the actual, like the fan part of the leaf attaches to the petiole, which is called the hastula. And one of the defining characteristics of Sable Atonia from all the other sables is it has very short hastulas. That's something that you'll notice when you actually have one in your hand and you can see it. They tend to be very short. Once you notice that characteristic, you see with the other ones. And they have a costa palmate leaf, which means that on the bottom of the leaf, you'll see a structure called costa. And it's basically an extension of the petiole, and it's what gives it that nice recurve. And fruits are generally about 1 centimeter or less. So this is an individual at Archibald Biological Station. I looked at about 300 individuals that day, and I found only 2 with trunks. This was one of them, to give you an idea of how rare that characteristic is. That trunk is about less than 1 meter long, and it's not vertical. What that means is that this is generally the result of a disturbance. These individuals don't grow naturally with a trunk vertically like you would get with a palmetto. This is almost always because of erosion or a disturbance that tilts a plant over, or a freak mutation. So this is pretty much your typical habitat. There's not a whole lot of canopy cover. You're going to have a lot of scrub pine, a lot of grasses and other endemic species, and it just grows right in sugar sand. And very rarely out of all these individuals were they above 1 meter from ground to canopy. They were very, very small. And they can grow in just really rough conditions. This one was actually spotted growing along a trail side, basically in 100% sand. And it was doing fine. There were individuals spotted down the line that were actually flowering and fruiting. Like, I had no issue with it. And they have a low tolerance for inundation. So things that are very dry adapted don't like being wet, and vice versa. This is one of those cases where they can't really handle water. We've seen this in nursery work. But they can do really well in dry. So it's really well adapted to fires. This individual was post-burn about 2 weeks or so. And you can see it's producing inflorescence. It's healthy. It's doing its thing. And most of the other plants were charred to the ground in that burn. Generally, the lack of a stem is either thought to be a response to adaptive conditions. Basically, if it gets really rough out there, the palm can just not produce a stem. Or it's a response to fires, that it's an adaptation where in an area that has frequent fires, it just doesn't develop a stem can't burn away, plant survives. Kind of like how you see with Sereno repens. So looking at Itonia histology, it is extremely compact. It's very robust tissue, and it pretty much reflects the habitat in which it lives. It's going to be fairly efficient for retaining that moisture, not as much as say like in a puncha cactus or something like that, because it's just fundamentally different. But for a palm, it does a pretty good job of regulating that moisture. So sable miamiensis was described in 1985 from specimens collected around the city of Miami, Florida. It's critically endangered and endemic sable species, and it's named the Miami palmetto. This thing is exceedingly rare. I suspect that there may be more individuals in the wild than the ones that I have seen, just because of how fragmented its habitat was. It's entirely possible, but it's exceedingly rare. To my knowledge, there's only about 100 individuals in the wild scattered across two populations. It's along the Pine Rocklands in Dade County and along the Atlantic coastal ridge that runs up the eastern seaboard of Florida. I don't know how far north it gets. Our most recent collection that I can confirm is around that like Broward County line area, so not terribly far up it. A couple of defining characteristics is that the inflorescences have about 3 orders of branching counting off the main stem, and fruit are greater than 1.5 centimeters. So these have fairly large fruit, almost like marbles. Pretty much no other sable in Miami-Dade County will naturally produce fruit that big. You'll get things that get up to be 1.4, but once you start getting into the 1.5, 1.9 size, it has to be pretty much. There's some stuff that will influence that, so it's not 100% a characteristic, but it's definitely a strong characteristic to acknowledge if it's seen. And something of note, seeds have a very high viability with all the other sables, greater than 90% with no intervention. So without trying to pollinate or anything, nature takes its course, you get 90% plus. I think in the last batch from wild seed I germinated, we got like 98, 99% viability. So they do pretty well. And they are self-compatible to the best of my knowledge. They're very durable, they're very hardy. They can survive fires, they can be cut to the ground. That individual in the image was actually chainsawed to the ground by accident, and it is recovering. So they can be really abused and still come back, almost like a Serenoa, where it's almost impossible to kill them. They're found in shallow, sandy, alkaline soils, so they need well-drained, think like native blueberries and cactus type ecosystem. Very, very dry. And they're generally trunkless or with a very short stem. Generally, what I mean by that is something that is less than a meter. So it almost doesn't look like a stem. If you've seen Serenoa, where it just ever so slightly crops out of the ground, that's what I'm talking about, where it's not going to form anything that looks like a subball palmetto. And it's somewhat tolerant in the shade, but full sun is preferred. This is very much a full sun, high heat, low shade species. It can grow with some shade, but I would not recommend it. And leaves are strongly coastal palmate and deeply divided. That was another distinguishing characteristic. They have almost a full circle when they are fully mature, and they're deeply divided with a large amount of leaflets. And hastelae or hastelas are generally greater than 4 centimeters, but less than 7, and are asymmetrical. So when you look at the palm, it's got that little triangle. Generally, the asymmetrical means one side is going to be substantially longer than the other. And the whole structure will be greater than 4, less than 7. Anything above 7 is almost certainly a palmetto. So they're seemingly fire adapted, and there are numerous individuals I've seen with burn marks on them growing fine. That one was charred, I believe, a month or so prior to me doing a site visit on it, and it was growing fine. But in that burn, we actually noticed 2 individuals that had a mortality event. So it does happen, and these were not small little grass palms. These were fully mature individuals. So it does happen, but I think I can safely say they are fire adapted species. I don't think they have anywhere near the mortality rate that you would expect in a non-fire adapted species. Very, very, very hardy. So looking at the histology, they have pretty dense vascular bundles. They have very stiff leaves, and they're pretty compact, more compact than palmetto, less than Atonia. So Atonia is going to be that quintessential, just absolutely efficient palm because it grows in sand, you know. Miamiensis grows in similar conditions, but not as intense with that regard. So it is allowed some level of abundance in that more hydric tissue. And then palmetto and minor obviously being more wet adapted, you're not going to see that sort of evolutionary pressure. So kind of comparing them all together, we've got Atonia at the top, palmetto at the bottom, and then Miamiensis on the right. And then the three of Miamiensis at the top, those are going to be from the garden collections, which were historical collections in the early 80s and 90s. And then the one on the bottom is going to be the rediscovery. So that was about a year old. So they're all fairly consistent. You can see there's not a huge, massive swing of difference. They're all pretty related, and we know this. You know, they're all fairly similar. But what differentiates them is their specializations and their habitats in which they occupy. So when we start looking at floral structures, your typical sable flower is going to be on the left. That is a Miamiensis flower, but they all look pretty much similar. But what is not similar is the palm volatiles. So the actual attractant chemicals it effuses is not going to be the same. They all are slightly different. We don't know if that impacts pollinator. We assume that they all attract various generalist pollinators because the differences are not great enough to be selective, but that is an assumption. And then on the right, pretty much your ideal sable pollen, that is a Miamiensis pollen grain. They all kind of look like almost like little coffee beans, which is fun. So when you start really getting under the hood and when you start looking at SEM imagery, so this is scanning electron microscopy, really, really high detail. You can't really appreciate it on a PowerPoint presentation, but you have flowers of each major species. With Miamiensis, we actually have an embryo extracted, and then the pollen granules. And they're all pretty much the same across the board. You wouldn't expect to see a major difference with a close related like sister species. So it tracks with what we know. When you really do start looking at it, there are subtle differences with all of them. And you tend to see similar flowers out the gate. So it's not necessarily, not one's going to be purple or anything like that. That's a nice distinguishing characteristic. If you're around them a lot, you will notice that the scents are slightly different. You tend to pick up sables by their smell once you get really used to it. That starts to happen in midsummer with palmetto. And then as you start to move towards fall, you start getting more of that Miamiensis flowering. And they do have, I don't want to say distinct because there is a considerable amount of overlap, but they do have phenological cycles where certain months will peak for different species for the most part. And we assume that they attract generalist pollinators, which is a heavy assumption because we don't know. There were pollinator studies on palmetto, which said generalist. And we're just assuming because of that with palmetto that Miamiensis and Atonia may have a similar pollinator attractant strategy. And the other interesting thing is flowers will self-pollinate and they wilt in a day. You only have about a 24-hour window before the flowers wilt. And Miamiensis tends to flower in the late summer with fruits becoming mature early to mid-autumn. That runs pretty true. Most of these palms will run on a clock. So you're going to start seeing things like Marittima and Yapa, which are in the Caribbean, start flowering now. Palmetto is going to be putting up inflorescences that'll be ready in another couple of months. And then from there, you're just going to start seeing Miamiensis start flowering. They all kind of have these distinct cycles that you get used to. And they have a similar cycle where it flowers and then a handful of months, generally around like 4 or 5 or so, you'll start seeing fruit. What month it is varies per species, also per locale. So one of the interesting things is when you look at it from a individualistic level of like what is a quintessential sable palm, you start out with a small brown seed. And something I like to point out is that they have this little hatch where the pollen tubule had formed. It's really hard to see, but there's that little structure emerging. And that's actually the beginning of the plant growing. So the hatch opens and the plant begins. So in a couple of weeks, you'll have something that looks reasonably like a plant germinating, but that will just be in an actual soil environment. That would just be a very small leaf tip emerging. Then in a few months, you start getting something that actually starts resembling a plant. In a few years, that individual is about 5 years old. You get something that looks like more of a mature plant. You start getting more juvenile leaves. And then in a couple decades, you will get an actual plant. That individual is 40 years old. So to say they're slow growing is an understatement. And it does take about that long to get an individual that is fully mature. Now, I will say in the juvenile form, they do produce fruit and flowers and seed about 5 years in. So you don't have to wait 40 years for them to get big, but. So what are we doing to actually conserve this thing? So we are harvesting seeds from the wild and captive populations as part of a conservation plan.
That previous photo,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned that one was chainsaw to the ground.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You would have cut that all right there to the ground. Only to have it come back.
So that's an excellent point. That individual, probably not. Some of the individuals are more subterranean than others. This one is more above ground. I have seen both that are like that did not survive being cut to the ground. Some have. So it's difficult to say what the threshold is for how much can you have above ground before it dies. But I've seen more survive than I've seen more die. Let me put it like that.
And the ones with the submerged into the nurse.
Mm-hmm.
I know that Tony flower.
Yes. Yeah. I don't have photos of individuals like that. I do. I've seen it in the wild. But yeah, most of them will be completely subterranean. Yeah. You do not need to reach this stage in order to have a flower and a fruiting plant. Realistically, that is the stage in which they will actually be mature. And notice the only thing that is visible above ground is just that saxophone style root growth. That's it. That's all you need. That plant is fully reproductively mature. So you do not need for them to reach this stage in order to be fully mature. And honestly, it's been suggested that when they get like that, that's probably just either them emerging out of the ground because they've hit something hard and they just can't go any deeper, or just through natural growth. This is a 40-year-old specimen, you know. So for example, that little one that we put in the ground is fully mature, and that is just a leaf petiole. So generally, you will get about that big up to, I'd say, a 10-centimeter diameter, I don't want to call it a stem, but plant above ground that I've seen cut. There are some that were larger that also were cut and survived, but I would say for the most part, more survived than died. And we have begun piloting reintroduction strategies. So really what the whole goal is, we need to get genetic diversity in nursery growing so that eventually we can put these individuals back out here so that these populations have enough diversity to grow. We're also trying some interesting stuff where we're actually trying tissue culture with them, but more on that later. So sable miamiensis versus sable Atonia. That is an Atonia in the foreground, miamiensis in the background. They're pretty similar species. Habitat differences are key. That is going to be one of your major things that you're going to be looking at. There are leaf morphology characteristics that ring true for Atonia versus miamiensis. The biggest one is going to be that hastiliform, length, number of leaflets, and inflorescence branching.
In that photo, were they growing in the same soil, or were they?
Yeah, so this is actually in a garden. So the miamiensis is planted in the rear. It's in the exact same soil, exact same conditions, about 20 feet apart. You would not see this in the wild. Yeah. So when you actually start looking at them, main differences is going to be in the hastilla, the habitat, the inflorescence orders, and branching and fruit size. This is key. Those are your major characteristics you want to use. There are other diagnostic characteristics I haven't listed here that are a little bit more difficult to discern in the field and are not necessarily as useful. If there is a specimen of which you think is a miamiensis, there are additional characteristics you can use to verify it, but it's difficult if you don't have provenance information where it came from, where it was harvested from. Right. So right. So that's an excellent point. One of the things that actually, I believe it's actually on this slide. Yes. So I'm saying alkaline soils for stable mimiensis. I am less on the pine rockland definition than I am on alkaline sandy soils. So that is kind of the thing that I'm looking at more so, not necessarily pine rocklands, because there have been confirmed individuals in not pine rocklands. However, the characteristic that is consistent among those is alkaline or near neutral soils that have a high sand content. So the wild ones we have not yet. Those are flying by the soil survey maps that were done about the 50s. So it's historical.
There's a publication by Palmettos.
Yep. Yes.
Some of the soils.
So,
Typically, what you see are these.
so that's a great point. I read that paper. The sites in which it occurs are on the alkaline side. So it still holds true because the sites that that paper proposes are either at near neutral or alkaline. They don't cross that barrier. Seven's neutral. Yeah, the sites in which it occurs are on the alkaline. Well, between alkaline.
The vast majority of pine rocklands, say some
Yeah.
of these sandy pockets,
Yeah.
when you get these different packs. Really, the closest relatives are the sand village.
Mhm. Yeah, that's completely correct. But from what I've found, the habitat range for mimiensis is very restricted. That it is not all pine rocklands. It is not diffused within all scrubby pine rocklands. It is a specific section of a very specific habitat type within a very specific set of pine rocklands. You know, so it's, yeah, I suspect that it was. Yeah, that's pretty much it. That's my take on why it's so rare. Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of these would have been in alkaline or coquina moderated sands, very shallow on top of oolite, and it would have been like 1% of a pine rockland. But when we're looking at it, kind of the major differences between them, first off the bat, is going to be a trunk. If it has a trunk that is above, I'd say 5 meters is a sure bet, that is going to be a stable palmetto. If it does not have a trunk, you have 3 options. The easiest way is if you know where it was collected or where it naturally grows. If it's extremely wet, it's going to be a stable minor. If it's not extremely wet, you've got 2 options, stable mimiensis or stable latonia. If it is growing in a scrubby, dry area, central Florida, more than likely stable latonia. If it is growing in a more rocky, alkaline, or at least near neutral, not that deep acidic sands, probably mimiensis. What you're gonna wanna look at are the number of leaves, the ground to canopy height, how deeply divided the leaves are, how many leaves are on it. Anecdotally, stable mimiensis tends just to be larger than most of the Atonia I've seen in the wild. It's a pretty large plant. When Dr. Noblick and I first found the population, individuals were taller than me. Not necessarily trunk, but from ground to canopy. So leaf tips were taller than me. And when I was at Archibald going through those areas, I didn't really find a single Atonia that was as tall as me, to give you an idea for that. So these plants are pretty big, all things considered, though they don't form trunks. So this is mainly just going to be that petiole length and just how big the leaves are. The other thing you want to look at is mainly the hashla size, length, shape, characteristics like that. But mimiensis is still exceedingly rare. And unless you have a collection that was made probably in the 90s, it's probably not mimiensis. All right, so what's next? What am I going to be doing? So kind of the big thing is I'm going to be doing a genomic population analysis of both Florida and Caribbean suball. So I'm really trying to figure out what's going on there. There's going to be taxonomic revisions and just looking at how everything is. Basically, the last modern phylogeny we had was Dr. Scott Zona's in the early 90s. I'm revisiting that with genomic information, seeing if that holds true to current technique. And the other thing that maybe I've noticed some people is that I'm also investigating something that is called Sable SP, which is potentially something different. This is the one that people call Everglades palmetto. This is that short palmetto that flowers, fruits, and does all its stuff. Well, it's short. It doesn't form a trunk. Some people have seen that in the wild, down in the Everglades, Pine Rocklands, in that associated area. Some people have it in nursery as that Everglades form. It's basically a palmetto, tiny seed, no trunk. Tissue culture and advanced horticulture. So one of the big things is that we need a lot of Miamiensis if we want to actually get established populations. Generally, most reintroduction of palms, from what we've seen out in Big Pine with Pseudophoenix sargentii, is that at best you'll get about 80% survive year one. The average, I believe, for that study was around 5%, and they outplanted hundreds. So we need a lot if we want to make a difference. And we can get a lot of seed, but what is even better than seed is actually having what's called synthetic seeds or microplantlets. So ideally, what we're going to be doing is taking a seed, extracting the embryo, and making many, many individual seeds, if you will, from that one. So instead of hundreds of seeds, we can do tens of thousands of seeds if we wanted to do something like that, so that we can start moving more individuals out. So the goal is to get a protocol that works. That sort of work is very species specific, very individual specific, and it's going to take a lot of time just to typify a protocol that will work before we can get to that stage. And the big goal is to reintroduce self-sufficient populations of Sable Miamiensis out into the wild. We want to see this thing thrive in its natural habitat. And that's kind of the big goal, is how do we get there? Well, the first thing we need is more plants. Well, we need plants in order to do reintroductions. And since we know that they have a pretty decently high failure rate, we need a lot of plants. So there's a lot of work and a lot of thought going into how we can do this the best possible way that we can do this, so that there is a thriving Miamiensis population for generations to come. All right, that does it for me. I would like to give a massive thank you out to the Miami-Dade County EEL team, Montgomery staff, friends and family, to my advisor, Dr. Mir Kadamzadeh, everyone that made this possible. This has been a massive effort for everyone involved, and I really appreciate everyone's support during this time. Thank you.
About the saw palmetto. Is that kind of variability in the saw palmetto?
So saw.
Can you repeat the questions for the?
Sure. Yes. So we're talking about saw palmetto, which is Serenoa repens. Is that reflected in the variability in palmetto or in sabal? So saw palmetto is Serenoa repens. It's in a different family. It was previously called sabal or sable cerulata, but modern evidence suggests that it's not even related to any of the other sables. That is in a completely different genus.
But amongst the saw palmetto, is there also this kind of variability?
So my understanding is that there are a couple different forms. I don't know how much of it has been classically identified in taxonomy, but most people say that there's a blue or green form and then a silver form. And depending on the habitat type, you can see different forms. I'm not sure how much of that is reflected in like the variability. That is true, that it's variable, but you don't necessarily get saw palmettos that are going to be trunked or trunkless or with huge fruit. They all tend to be pretty similar. The leaf color is just different for the most part. So while they have variability, they don't have as much as sabal. Sabal has a massive amount of variability within the entire genus.
The first question is, so if your eventual goal is to reintroduce the species into the wild, so I assume this is going to be something you figure out through the course of your research, but how will you know which sites you're introducing it to? 'Cause I mean, it sounds like you're still narrowing down exactly where the species.
Right. So the easiest way of doing that is where does it grow now? So there's plenty of restored additions to some of these sites. So we're reintroducing to that restored because one of the things about Miamiensis is that it just does not like to recruit itself. It has, from what I can tell in the wild, pretty gnarly recruitment rates. So very, very low. So what we're trying to do is just give it a little head start of putting some mature individuals out there and just seeing if it takes. Because we want to just make sure that, hey, it might have a better survival rate for outplantings than what we expect. That makes our job easier. It might have a worse rate, which means we have to change how we approach this. So the first thing off the bat is we go where it already is, or very close to where it already is. And then from there, as our information improves and we learn more about it and where it grows, then we can try different sites and see.
Question I had was about the tissue culture. So you were saying I don't know which techniques you're going to be using, but whatever techniques you were referring to at the embryo, would that preserve genetic diversity if you were to, it wouldn't be a clone that you're planting 100 times. You would be using a technique that preserves unique, they would be unique individuals, or would they be kind of clones of each other?
Okay, so talking about tissue culture and its implications on cloning, or if it are clones, they are not explicitly clones. So one of the things about tissue culture and the techniques I'm using is called somoclonal variation. Basically, because you're taking an entire genome and cloning it a bajillion times in order to get that one somatic embryo, you're going to get a natural amount of variation within that genome. So while you have almost like a template, there's going to be a little bit of variation. Generally, the variation is so low that they are effectively clones, but not necessarily. So while they are distinct individuals, they are not too far off of the parentage. Now, there are strategies to both minimizing that and potentially maximizing that, depending on what your outcome is. But mind you, the more mutations you get, these aren't going to be influenced by evolution. They're not going to be influenced by the environment. They're random for the most part, which means you will probably get characteristics that make them not look like sable miamiensis, or not hold the desirable characteristics, or not survive, So somoclonal variation has to be managed to a certain extent. But at the same time, they're all not explicitly clones. Gray area. Yes.
Follow-up question to yours actually is, in the remaining individuals, is there enough genetic diversity to establish sustainable populations? And is let's say the calcitrants, the low germination rates, could that possibly be related to low genetic diversity in the population? I don't know.
So we're talking about genetic diversity and potential recalcitrance of palms. So the thing about Miamiensis is that it actually has a really high germination rate. So there doesn't appear to be a classical inbreeding barrier. We're getting greater than 90% by. They were all very high.
Well, they're all high.
They're all high. No. So Miamiensis has low recruitment. They have low recruitment where you don't necessarily see the seed grow in the wild into a plant, but in conditions, the seed will just grow. So that includes just in a pot with dirt and it gets watered, it grows. It grows in a lab in agar, they grow. Talking about the genetic diversity, that's an excellent question. That's actually one of the primary reasons we're doing the genomic population analysis. So while we're looking at a taxonomic and phylogenetic overview for all suball, we are also looking at the inter and intra population dynamics. That's basically looking at site A, how much variability do we have? And does site A contribute to site B's diversity? And how different are they? So that's part of that, so that when we go to actually plan which crosses we're doing, we have that information. From what I've seen in the wild, where we're not really getting those traditional barriers to seed germination that would imply that there's a bottlenecking occurring, I suspect that we have enough to establish some level of population.
Thank you.
So
Welcome.
Gwen Berzicki, who is joining us on YouTube, just wanted to relay that she has 3 sable Etonias that she rescued from Barry University in the 1990s, which she suspects were once common in that area, but the development was already pretty severe by the time any surveys were going on.
And where was this?
Barry University, she says.
Very Miami Shores. Yeah, so sable Latonia had been noted historically as occurring in the coastal areas of Dade County along like Key Biscayne and then along the coast, and then things even as Deering at one point. However, I'm currently of the mindset that it is probable that Sabal Latonia did not actually occur in Dade County, that those were historical collections of Mamiensis because they were extremely closely related visually, morphologically. I've looked at some of the herbaria specimens. It's really hard to tell a Mamiensis from an Etonia from an herbarium specimen because with palms, it's a leaf. It's literally just a leaf or an inflorescence and a couple of seeds or flowers. You don't get the individuals, you don't get the habitat characteristics. So you're kind of relying on that diagnostics with the leaves, and nature's nature. It's 80-90% accurate. You know, sometimes you get a weird thing, and if you collect that one weird thing, it throws off everything. But I would like to sample some of the historical Etonia collections and see if that is truly Etonia or if it was just historical Mamiensis that it flew under the radar. Any other questions? Ooh, that's a good one. So that went to, so the specific grant I received from FNPS went specifically towards genomic research. So it is helping basically fund that massive study looking at sable Mamiensis, and it also funded some of the tissue culture work that I'm doing as well. So it went directly to helping conserve that critically endangered endemic palm. Hit me.
2 questions.
Yes. Okay.
The first one is, do the sables hybridize? They're all
Ooh.
sables here, and it seems like my is stuck around despite being surrounded by palmetto. Are they hybridizing or are they not so much?
Great question. So we're asking about hybridization with sable. So here's what I can tell you. Sable bazoriensis is considered to be an ancient cross of palmetto and minor. That is realistically the only true sable hybrid that I am aware of. Other sables that I have seen don't necessarily readily hybridize. There may be some very rare examples, either in horticultural practice where it's a deliberate cross, things like that. But in the wild, from what I can tell, if it's growing and it looks like a palmetto, it's probably going to be a palmetto. If it's growing and looking like a Mamiensis, it's probably going to be a Mamiensis. So I am of the mindset that they do not readily hybridize. You could probably force it to happen, but if it hybridizes, my understanding is it's probably also not going to produce viable seed as well.
So there's less of a danger of people bringing in non-native sables and hybridizing.
I do not suspect that they will hybridize. What I would expect to happen is that you would get intergressions. So you would start seeing things that are not a Florida sable. So picture in your mind a Miami-Dade County sable. What does it look like? You know, are we talking about a tall, 20-meter tall sabal? We're talking about one of them short, stubby ones that you see out in the Everglades that are only about 5 meters tall.
You're theorizing that might be the state taxon. Because I have one of those that I rescued. It's true. I had a seedling sable growing in my yard. It's true. When I rescued, it's 30 years old. It might have 2 meters.
That is what I'm thinking. And one of the things that I thought about when I got to that was that in the 1800s, I'm not sure of the date, Bakari was in the Bahamas, a palm discoverer, taxonomist. And in one of his writings, he wrote that I see a new form of palmetto encroaching Bahamas. It is abundant and is not natural, or something to that effect. And mind you, Bakari had a habit of every island getting their own species. So he was a splitter, not a lumper, disclosure. However, he made that notation that, hey, there's a different palmetto. I don't really know where it's coming from. And given that it was the Bahamas and given that trade was started, I'd assumed that it was coming over from Florida. And that's kind of where you got into the whole debate of is Sable bahamanensis its own thing or not? Because that's an internal question. So kind of the point I'm making is sables look different depending on where you look. Most are pretty similar, but there are differences between them. And I don't know what that short form is in the short note. I don't know. Yeah, so that's why I said it's the eternal question.
But my other question,
Mhm.
you may or may not know, these packs have been in Florida for how many thousands of years? Sable Euclonia goes back to ice ages, right?
Yeah.
Right?
Mhm.
Sable palmetto must also, correct?
Mhm.
So it stands to reason, probably Sable miamiensis is probably not a recent
Yeah,
evolution, right?
I'd assume so.
I propose this. You mentioned that these palms are adapted to fire, which I see on the street.
Mhm.
But I don't think that's the primary contributor to why they don't develop trunks. I think the reason why they don't develop trunks is extinct megafauna. It makes sense because there used to be ground sloths here, there used to be mastodons. We're working with David Black, and he mentioned he lived in Palm Beach, that Lion Country Safari, they feed the elephants, the palm leaves, and eat them like candy. Evolution in terms of modern term days, but surely mastodons foraging through Florida, these giant ground sloths, that triggered evolutionary responses. It's not just the palms. I mean, if you look at the needle palm, it also doesn't really have much of a trunk. It's got this wicked needle. It grows, I'm guessing, with not. If you look at things like Doringa-thamnus, they are so deep underground, it stands to reason the lies adapt strategies probably prevent them from being.
So I have two things to say to that. Thing one is that there was a recently published chronoalign phylogeny that shows that Miamiensis and Etonia emerged roughly around the same time on evolutionary wise speaking. They came out around the same time. Two, that's an excellent point. So one of the conundrums I've been dealing with is what can eat a 1.3 centimeter seed and survive? Because palmetto birds can eat it small, less than a centimeter, a couple millimeters, easy. Etonia, still smaller. Gopher tortoises do it. Why is Miamiensis really the only one that struggles to recruit? Why is that? Well, seeds are viable, 90, 100% viability in some cases. They grow just fine. They only grow if the outer fruit pulp is removed off it, which means something needs to eat it. So what can eat basically a bunch of marbles and survive? They are. They're able to pass, but mind you, think about where this thing lives. It's really far out there in some of the rougher conditions. And there's not going to be a whole lot of food because I haven't seen native saw palmetto where Miamiensis grows in abundance. It's there, small pockets. I don't know if that's because of the disturbance. Right. But that's the point I'm getting at, though, is that I haven't been able to figure out that piece of the puzzle as to what disperses it. And one of the things that I was thinking of is megafauna, because we're talking about, dispersal mechanics, something big. So I myself down into the far bits of the Everglades, and I was looking at one of these sites. Mind you, this is one of the stunted form of palmetto, and the seeds are smaller, but I just want to see dispersal dynamics of palmetto specifically. And over a 20-year period as validated by both imaging and, overhead imaging and LiDAR, you can see palms disperse out of natural habitat. And you know what they have in that site? Deer, which is an animal that is large enough to consume a bunch of marbles and poop it out a quarter mile down the way and be fine. And I suspect that on an evolutionary scale, there probably was a larger animal that consumed Mamiensis seeds. And probably by the time that Dr. Zona got to describing them, they were already imperiled, which is one of his key findings in his species announcement, was that he thinks it's already extinct in the wild. Thought when he wrote it back in the 80s, was that it was already imperiled. So while we were bulldozing its habitat and removing its seed disperser, its population numbers were probably already crashing long before. And that was one of the first things that human settlers, colonizers did, was they hunted out large animals from the forests. So it's possible that for a long time, it didn't have a strong intermediary. Small things will disperse them because we have existing populations. You know, a rat here, a bird here, but I don't know if the dispersers for salt palmetto, like gopher tortoises, will go after Mamiensis fruits. I don't know if they recognize as food. I've been looking at sites that have Mamiensis and gopher tortoises, but it's extremely rare to see that, and it's very hard to tell that if the seed that.
I'm sure bear.
Oh, 100%. I'm sure bear is too, but kind of the thing is, does it even recognize it as food on the plant? You know, I'm sure it'll eat it, you know, if it's brought to it, but it's a difficult question. But I suspect that things like bear, deer, and gopher tortoises are the present day, and also probably raccoons too, are the present day dispersal mechanisms. But that's something that is of active interest in study because it's a part of the evolutionary puzzle I can't figure out. Of course, thank you.
Tickets, insert you at the back, get some snacks.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming tonight.
Awesome presentation.
Thank you. How are we doing on time?
Oh, we're excellent.
Oh, good.